On BBC World News, the latest business news from across the globe. World Business Report.
Searching for new jobs, Google parent Alphabet cuts 12,000 roles, becoming the latest big tech name to slash its workforce. Talking dollars in Dakar, US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen kicks off her Africa trip in Senegal. Why does the US want stronger ties? Hello and welcome to World Business Report. I'm Jonathan Josephs. Thanks for joining us wherever you're watching from. We'll start with the latest round of job cuts in the tech industry. Google's parent Alphabet says it's cutting 12,000 roles from its teams around the world. In a memo to staff, Chief Executive Sundar Pichai said that the company's mass hiring over the last 2 years was for a different economic reality than the one we face today. It comes just days after Microsoft became the latest in a string of big tech firms to make cuts to its workforce as the global economy slows. Well, let's get more on this and bring in our correspondent, Samira Hussein, who joins us from New York. Samira, what's driving all these job cuts?
Broadly speaking, of course, corporate America is very concerned about what is to come in the United States when it comes to the economy, and many companies are gearing up for a potential recession. Specifically to tech companies, and even more specifically to Alphabet, the parent company of Google. Sundar Pichai had said a few things. One, there was a mass amount of hiring that happened during the pandemic, when the need for more people at tech companies, and specifically Google, was really at an all-time high. But, to his own credit, he's admitted that, look, we grew too big, too fast, and now we really need to try and pare down. The other economic reality for them is that when it comes to advertising revenue, that's really dropped quite a bit. And you're seeing that in the earnings that they have been releasing, that quarter over quarter, they're losing a lot of advertising revenue. And as a result, they want to trim its workforce and to try and concentrate on specific areas. Most specifically, of course, it's all about artificial intelligence.
Samira Hussein, still in a job there for us in New York. Thank you very much for the latest on Google there and Alphabet. Now, the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has said that US investments in Africa are motivated by a mutually beneficial long-term relationship. She was speaking in Senegal's capital, Dakar, on the start of a three-country tour of the continent. She's there to outline President Biden's commitment to Africa and make sure that governments there see Washington as a viable alternative to the billions of dollars they've been getting from China. Both of the world's two biggest economies are interested in access to Africa's raw materials, amongst other things. Here's a little bit of what Miss Yellen had to say.
The U.S. is committed to working with Africa to realize the promise of a better economic future. We know that a stronger African economy is good for the world and good for America, and the work you're doing here is really incredible.
Well, let's bring in our guest, Indigo Ellis, who is the Managing Director of Africa Matters, a business consultancy that works on projects across the continent. Thanks for joining us. After this, Janet Yellen's on her way to Zambia and to South Africa. What is it that governments and business leaders there want to hear from her?
I think ultimately the pivot that the US is making towards repositioning themselves as equal partners is very welcome to business leaders and political leaders across Zambia, South Africa, and Senegal. I think the US is finally prioritizing the African economic story, but I think they're still lacking the political and financial support for US business that will see this kind of influx into the commercial space on the continent that Biden is seeking. There are still many concerns that African governments have around the US's new commitments. It's a step in the right direction, but the reservations remain. First, the US consistently wants to be the primary partner, and we see this even when we talk about an alternative partner, but instead should accept to be one of several partners. And second, the political leaning is changeable and inconsistent in Africa's eyes when it comes to the US. You know, there's a long memory of the Trump administration and various statements that he made against African countries. And then thirdly, and probably the most important, is that too many contingencies are leveraged on this support by the US, such as democracy and governance issues, where you don't see those same kind of contingencies levied by Russia or China, for example.
And Indigo, when Janet Yellen talks about a mutually beneficial relationship, is that how African leaders see it too? Or do they fear that, that the US and China are both just competing for access to their raw materials for things like the batteries in electric vehicles?
I think when we think about this, the most important thing is to think of African leaders as having agency. Of course, these are the countries, they are sovereign countries that they are running. And that is lost in a lot of this debate around the geopolitical influences at play on the continent. I think ultimately, governments want as many partners as possible to be able to choose from, pick the right kind of options for them and the right kind of cases. They don't want to be kind of constrained by the US saying, oh, if we communicate or we cooperate with you on a certain issue, we want democratic reform, or we want you to turn your back on Russia or China. It has to be a free playing field, and I think that's where African governments have issues with US support.
Indigo Ellis from the business consultancy Africa Matters, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
The Irish Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, says he regrets that the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was agreed as part of the Brexit negotiations, has been imposed on the region without the consent of both communities. Speaking to the BBC about the protocol, he sounded highly conciliatory, but suggested that the protocol was working economically without being fully implemented.
I do have regrets, and the regret that I have is that in the same way Brexit was imposed on Northern Ireland without the support of both communities. The protocol was imposed on Northern Ireland without the support of two communities, and that wasn't possible at the time for various reasons, in part because the executive was not functioning, so there's no one to speak for Northern Ireland, but that has created difficulties. Economically, broadly speaking, the protocol is working. There's no hard border between North and South. The single market's integrity has been protected. The Northern Ireland economy is outperforming the UK economy, but I can understand how unionists and unionist politicians feel that the protocol has lessened the links, weakened the union between Northern Ireland and Britain, and also that it exists without them having a proper say as to how it operates.
Leo Varadkar there on Brexit. Now, in some other news this hour, Japan's prices are rising at the fastest pace in 41 years, with energy and processed food seeing some of the biggest increases. The Consumer Prices Index hit 4% in December. That compares to an annualized inflation rate of 3.7% in November. It adds to pressure for the central bank to increase interest rates, which have been at minus 0.1% for years and have been on the rise in other major economies. The International Monetary Fund has warned that a failure to deal with the United States debt ceiling would have serious repercussions for both the world's biggest economy and the wider world. A spokesperson for the body, which focuses on global financial stability, said the various parties should get together quickly to find consensus on the matter. The head of the UN's International Labour Organization says he is concerned that job cuts around the world will lead to more social unrest this year as the global economy slows thanks to the pandemic, war in Ukraine and inflation. With this week, both Microsoft and, as you've been hearing, Google parent Alphabet have become the latest big names to announce job cuts in their thousands. Gilbert Hungbo was talking to my colleague Aaron Heselhurst and told him that while employment growth is expected to continue this year, population growth is faster.
We project globally, employment growth not more than 1%. So it tells you it's very little. And even if when you unpack that, you have part of the world like in North America where we believe unemployment will rise. In Europe, we expect more or less the same. When you look at Arab states and Africa, we might have a 3% increase in the employment. However, when you look at the increase in the working population, and that will again nullify a big part of that 3% gain.
And you can see more of that interview with the ILO's Director General Gilbert Hongo on Talking Business with Aaron Heselhurst this weekend. The times are on your screen now, with the first airing at 22:30 GMT on Friday. And that's all we've got time for on World Business Report. Thanks very much for joining us. Do remember there's plenty more on the website at bbc.com/business.